All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 13, Section 5, Women's Rights. So we've talked about some antebellum reforms already, whether that was things like temperance or the abolition movement. And one thing that was true of whatever reform movement that we're referring to, it's that both men and women participated in that, especially women, because we have to recall at this time women are excluded from politics, right? There is no vote and no holding office. So the question really for women is, well, what role do they play in the public sphere? And for many women in the United States, it was in these types of organizations that even though you couldn't go and cast your ballot at the ballot box, you could be part, or one could be part of a temperance organization, or one could be an abolitionist, and that way you could have your voice heard in the public. However, there were disagreements about the role of men and women in certain society or in certain organizations. So, for example, in the abolitionist movement, one of the questions was, should women participate? And some felt very much excluded. Some women felt very much excluded in many of these abolitionist movements, which kind of forced them to focus on a separate issue. And that, of course, is the issue of women's rights. So you can very much see this as a, there's sort of a causal effect here, that a lot of women participate in these various reform movements out in public. Other men in those organizations bring up what role they ought to play, or at least try to limit the role that they play in those organizations. And so instead of focusing on temperance and focusing on abolitionists, or the abolitionist movement, a lot of those women say, look, there's a more important issue that needs to be addressed, and that is specifically women's rights. If women are not seen as equals within the abolitionist movement, how can men and women both work together then to get rid of slavery, for example? So we'll talk about some of these early pioneers of the women's movement. Sarah and Angelina Grimke gave public lectures on abolitionism. And they found that when they would speak out in public, that oftentimes they would have to defend themselves for just simply being women. In other words, the question wasn't about abolition. The question thus became, what role or why do Sarah and Angelina have the right to speak out in public in this way? And so increasingly, rather than defend the issue of abolitionism, they began to demand, or at least defend, the position of women's rights. And of course, this is, specifically what role does women have, specifically in public, right, in the public sphere, which at this time was very much considered a male-dominated area. And so it's out of these reform movements that the women's rights movement, or the feminist movement, which is the women's rights movement, emerged. In Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848, the very first convention on women's rights was held. And so this is really considered, for the most part, to be like the origins or the very beginnings of the women's rights movement in the United States. Among those who attended included Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone. They are some of the pioneers in the women's rights movement. They had all been reformers in a certain way, or one way or another. The Grimke Sisters had been abolitionists before they became women's rights advocates. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an abolitionist. In fact, she became involved in the women's rights movement when she traveled all the way to London to go to an anti-slavery or an abolitionist meeting. And they wouldn't let her in because she was a woman. Susan B. Anthony, she was active in temperance. So, reform leads to the rights movement. And at Seneca Falls, New York in 1848, these women issued the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, which more or less was a kind of a copy of the Declaration of Independence. Of course, that was written by Thomas Jefferson. And instead of saying all men are created equal, it said all men and women are created equal. And, you know, Thomas Jefferson listed all the grievances that Great Britain had done against the 13 colonies in the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments. The authors listed all the grievances that men had committed against women. And one important thing came out of this convention, and that was the issue of suffrage, which really is the kind of focal point for the women's rights movement following 1848, which is the right to vote. There were a lot of ways in which women were not equals to men in American society in the antebellum period, and there were a number of issues that could have been addressed, but suffrage really came to the forefront as kind of the, the bullseye to aim for, so to speak. And so it was much, this women's rights movement was much political. There were also some other thinkers that advocated for women's rights. This issue of Republican motherhood, we had actually talked about it previously. Republican motherhood is the idea that women instill American or Republican values on their children. Catherine Beecher, who was an author, wrote The Duty of American Women to Their Country, which focused a lot on women being kind of the keepers of morality. So both of these, whether it's Republican motherhood or the right to vote or the feminist movement, both advocated for women's rights, but in one way you had, for example, suffrage that really kind of challenged gender norms of the time, whereas something like Republican motherhood or the idea that women were more morally pure than men use kind of traditional gender notions, didn't challenge those notions, but actually use them to try and gain more of a position in the public sphere.